Hi guys. Well, we can probably get started as people are slowly trickling into the virtual room. But it is with great pleasure that I want to introduce the sort of a deep dive session in Deals of Distinction. We had the award ceremony yesterday at the LSS annual meeting, and we heard from Alex in acceptance of the award, and obviously that has increased our interest more and more to want to learn about this fantastic contribution. This has really been a very fantastic year for life science per se, not only because of a deal activity, but also the exposure and the visibility that the industry has gotten in terms of really reacting and being able to contribute to the global health pandemic. So that's been fantastic. So I think one of the things we also did this year was to recognize one of those transactions like Pfizer and BioNTech with a special President's Award this year as well. So by way of introduction and opening this session, my name is Lalit Kaur. I'm on the board of Licensing Executive Society, career BD professional in different segments of pharma biotech space. And I was also the past chair of life science sector for the LES. And just to describe, every year we sort of run through the deals that have gone in this space. It's a peer-reviewed methodology. We look at all tons of different transactions that have gone in. We look at 5 primary criteria on which we weigh the transaction based on the impact on the industry, the value add to the partner, the complexity and creativeness, as we are all transaction people. We love creativity, and the breadth of IP involved, and of course, the size of the transaction. So with that, we had a working committee, which was led by myself and Gayatri Verma, who's a director of transactions at BD in AstraZeneca. And we also had tremendous amount of help with from Mark Edwards, who's at Bioscience Advisors and maintains a database of transactions pulled through from SEC filings, public disclosures. Needless to say, this was a very active year for business development. We had more than 200 deals to screen. We went through a couple of iterative processes from top 5 to top 3 to finally selecting a winner. And I'm glad it was the Denali and Biogen transaction, and a distinction for Biogen to be the winner twice in a row, because they won a deals of distinction last year as well. So kudos to Biogen team. Again, this is just an introductory slide to give a quick landscape or synopsis on how complex and complicated this transaction was, and is in breadth of the transaction. But I let the teams really dive more deeply into it and really give us the mechanics and bring us home in terms of all the pains and jubilations they lived through when they were going through the transaction and post-close. I will turn the table, maybe let you guys introduce yourself. From Denali, we have Mitesh, who is the leader of this transaction, Mark, who was obviously from corporate development as a team effort, and is also living the deal, I understand, from an alliance management perspective. And so he can blame Mitesh and Helen for things that he didn't like in the deal. And then Helen is joining us as well as part of the corporate development team, who are working together in getting this complex transaction completed. And from Biogen, we have Neil joining us. And Emma McBurney obviously was also involved from that perspective, and she was the recipient last year, and she also accepted the award on Biogen's behalf this year. So with that, I'll just, if you want to take the control now, or just let me know how you want to run the slide. I don't know who's going to start speaking first. The way we're going to run this session is we're going to, at least for all the audience, we're going to have the teams present the nitty-gritty of the transaction, so you have a better sense of what it is. And then we'll just open it up for more of a Q&A interactive session. I'll moderate. I'll have some questions as a guidance to get the team started, and we'll take any questions that you might want to throw in. I will try to monitor the chat, and I don't know if Casey or somebody from LES is also on the list, and they can also monitor the chat box to see if any questions are coming in, so we can address them as they come. With that, Mark, how do you want to do it? I can move the slide, and you want to start, or?
Sure. Thanks, Lalit. I think Mitesh is going to kick us off here, so I'll let Mitesh drive.
Next slide, please, Lalit. So what we'll do today is I'll maybe speak to the overview of the collaboration at a very high level. I think Neil will speak to the rationale for us choosing to work together, and then I think we'll end the kind of presentation component of this session with Mark spending a few minutes talking about how things are going now that we're 1 year into working together. So just to drill into Lalit's schematic from a couple of slides ago, this deal really has, from our perspective, two primary elements. The first is a collaboration around Denali's LRRK2 program. At the time of deal signing, we had 2 clinical stage small molecule LRRK2 inhibitors that we were actively developing, and the collaboration provides for both Denali and Biogen to co-develop and co-commercialize those assets in Parkinson's disease and potentially other indications as well. The second element of the collaboration is around the transport vehicle, which is Denali's clinically validated platform that facilitates the transport of large molecules across the blood-brain barrier following peripheral administration. So under this element of the collaboration, Biogen has an exclusive option to 2 programs enabled by Denali's transport vehicle, one of which has been named as being focused on amyloid beta, and then separately a right of first negotiation for up to 2 additional transport vehicle focused programs. And those 2 elements of the collaboration drive the financials, which are described in the gray box at the bottom of the page. At a high level, it's about $1 billion up front. It's about $2 billion in aggregate milestones. And then the collaboration facilitates a meaningful sharing of commercial economics, including with a formal profit split in the case of LRRK2 in the US and in the case of China. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks, Mitesh. So, the strategic rationale here was really to combine, Denali's experience in, LRRK2 biology, biomarker-driven biology, and then, the blood-brain barrier technology, with the Biogen, expertise, infrastructure in global clinical development and global commercialization in neuroscience and neurodegenerative diseases. Both companies, have a mutual commitment to LRRK2 as a mechanism of action, given the genetic component. And then ultimately, both companies were committed to bringing the, effective therapies to patients. And so the goal was really to accelerate and increase the chance of success of the LRRK2 program, and also leverage, the blood-brain barrier technology for safer and more efficacious therapies in a variety of neurodegenerative diseases.
So to Neil's point, with respect to the LRRK2 program, the focus was really to increase the joint probability of success of development and commercialization of these assets, which sort of drove the kind of collaboration structure for this particular element of the deal. So at the time that we pulled the trigger on execution, or shortly thereafter, the parties jointly selected one of the assets, DNL151 or BIIB122, to progress into late-stage clinical testing in Parkinson's disease, with the plan to run 2 parallel late-stage clinical studies in both LRRK2 mutation carriers and sporadic Parkinson's disease patients. And to ensure that both parties could equally contribute kind of expertise and capabilities and infrastructure, the collaboration for LRRK2 was set up to focus on co-development worldwide, with development costs being split between the parties and both parties contributing resources to this effort. We also, if we get there, will co-commercialize these assets in both the US and China, with a profit split of 50-50 in the US and 60-40, with Biogen taking home the lion's share of the profits in China as well. Next slide, please. And again, as Neil pointed out, consistent with the aim to create better brain penetrant therapeutics with an increased chance of success and better safety and better efficacy, the TV platform element of the collaboration was also set up to facilitate meaningful kind of work and support between the parties. So 2 elements to this. The first is an exclusive option to Biogen to license a TV-enabled A-beta program and 1 other TV-enabled program in Parkinson's disease. We use the phrase protein-based here to describe the focus of this option is really large molecules and not gene therapies or oligonucleotides or small molecules. And Biogen's options would be triggered at the initiation of IND-enabling studies. Additionally, Biogen also has a right of first negotiation to 2 additional TV-enabled protein-based programs as well. At the time that Denali, if we were to choose in the future to seek a partner for other programs that would fall into the remit of this right of first negotiation, we would have to have the conversation with our existing strategic partner, Biogen, first. And this right of first negotiation is really focused on, as Neil pointed out, neurodegeneration, which is an area that both parties are focused on. And we define neurodegeneration in this case as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, and multiple sclerosis. Next slide.
Great. So I guess the question is, how are we doing now that we're actually a year into this deal? And so I thought we would share just a brief snapshot of kind of what we've achieved thus far. And I would really kind of group this into 4 main areas. The first is around relationship establishment. And this really extends from scientist through to CEO. It's across multiple functions from discovery through to commercialization, and importantly, across multiple levels, really to ensure that there's a lot of visibility, there's a lot of proactive issue resolution and tactical as well as strategic alignment. Next, I'd say there's been a significant amount of advancement in the LRRK2 and the option programs, as Mitesh had alluded to. We've essentially aligned on the program moving forward. We've aligned on the clinical development plan, and we're progressing the option programs towards an opt-in. And a lot of this has been driven really by establishing many working groups. We've had to essentially act with an incredible sense of urgency, really trying to advance as quickly as possible into late stage development. And as part of that process, the joint teams have really undergone a number of very impactful decisions early on. As I alluded to, the aligning on the global development plan, we've had to engage jointly with health authorities and really plan for the late stage initiation. And so, bottom line at the end, it's required a lot of, I would say, open and very flexible mindsets here. And then, coming around the corner here, aligning on goals. It sounds very simple, but it literally was just that. Very early in the collaboration, each party put forward their list of kind of goals for the programs, which included corporate goals. And sounds simple, but an incredible, I think, amount of value going through that process, really to understand what is important for each company and how each company is being measured. And, luckily there was a lot of alignment already, but there are always areas where there are different drivers driving each company's goals. And I would say lastly is around a lot of learning here. You learn in terms of how each company has been works together, and this can be as simple as how we run meetings. Are they meetings where we're actually brainstorming? Are they informational meetings? Are they alignment meetings? Or are they decision-making meetings? And setting up the structure and really starting to understand that inevitably, when you have a smaller partner and a larger partner, there are differences in terms of the level of sensitivities across various issues that the alliances will encounter throughout the lifetime. And so this is really a time to learn from your partner's perspective and actually get a fresh perspective. And I think that what we've been seeing across the joint teams as they've been undergoing an incredible amount of scientific, rigorous debate on the programs is that having that fresh perspective, one, could open up new ideas, but two, it also really allows you to pressure test the scientific thinking and rationale that you have. And so ultimately, what we've seen here is you've got a joint team that's operating, at a very high level within 2 separate organizations. Next slide, please. And then maybe just to try to summarize where we're at with a simple picture here. I liken it to the roller coaster, and it's really what we've done thus far is we've basically built that infrastructure and the foundation. We've also kind of clicked into the ride, with our respective counterparts, and we've built an incredible amount of positive momentum. And right now, I would say that the joint teams are poised to advance into late stage development, and importantly, I think we all recognize we're on this incredibly exciting ride together. Thanks.
Thank you very much, both Denali and Biogen, for really giving us insights into the transaction. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in this because it's a fairly complex transaction. And I get it from. I think you said it right, Mark, because there was a lot of work done pre-transaction and then obviously post-transaction, and having those alignments and continuity certainly helps. So maybe I'll break my questions a little bit differently. Maybe I'll get your thoughts. Obviously, when you're looking at the transaction, we start with sourcing. So from your perspective, maybe Neil, you can get us started off on that. Was there a defined process? I mean, were you looking at a particular asset? Was it on your radar screen? Or how did you go about initiating a contact, or how was the contact made, or how did the transaction or the sourcing for this transaction come about?
Sure. Yeah. Happy to start, and then, other folks can chip in. Biogen, was looking to kind of continue to build its, neurodegeneration pipeline. I'm historically at Biogen, actually many existing products and even a lot, a decent amount of the clinical pipeline has been brought in through BD. So we're always sort of, kind of scanning the landscape. But I'll have to say in this instance, Denali ran a fairly disciplined process. So, I think they knew in sort of, mid to late 2019 that they wanted to do a deal in Q2, Q3 2020, and they kind of initiated contact. I know, I don't know the exact first contact, but I know there was a presentation given in November of 2019. I know Denali sent actually a draft term sheet probably in late December 2019. And then I know Denali's CMO, Carol Ho, came actually to Boston in February 2020 for a presentation. And then obviously in March, everything changed. But I remember first round bids were due in March. And I remember the first round term sheet, the markup we were submitting, and I think that was my last day in the office. It was March 6th. And so actually nobody was in the office except for a few people, but 2 of the 4 people that I saw in the office were pulmonologists. So I felt safe working on the term sheet and sending it out. And so, kind of that's really how we got involved. I mean, I think there had been relationships at different levels and different functions between the companies. And so I think that also helped. And it was just sort of, in some level, a fairly obvious, discussion to be had, given the goals of the 2 companies.
So it sounds like it was more of a defined process from Denali in terms of looking at, and they had pretty much figured out exactly what they were looking for, had a draft term sheet to propose. It's maybe from Denali's perspective, do you want to take a side and how are you going about this transaction, and how much homework you'd already done, and what kind of timeline expectations you had set, and how confident you were of hitting those timelines and getting the transaction done?
Yeah, sure. I can maybe lead things off on this, love it, and then Mitesh, if you want to jump in, I can talk you through kind of how the process actually got started. And for Denali, Neil is right. We had some very early conversations with some folks that we considered, marquee potential partners. But for us, it really kicked off at JP Morgan in 2020. And this is when Denali at the time presented some really exciting phase 1B data for our LRRK2 program, which was the first ever, data that had been shared for a LRRK2 inhibitor. And we noticed at that JP Morgan that there was significant interest from a number of pharma companies. And it was really then that I think Denali really started to implement a very structured partnering process, and obviously began to have conversations with other potential partners. I'd say our goal from the outset was to lead a process that was very fair and transparent. And I think, as Neil alluded to, we were very clear up front in terms of what our expectations were, most importantly for what we'll call the cornerstones of a potential deal. And I'll leave it to Mitesh to provide a bit more details on that. But I'd say, obviously we were looking for the best possible partner, somebody that brought expertise, commitment, and an appropriate amount of resources to the program, all with the spirit of trying to increase the likelihood of success. But maybe Mitesh can say a little bit about the cornerstones and the process by which we went through that.
I would agree with everything Mark said, and maybe just to take a half step back and provide a bit more context. We decided internally that we would seek a partner to help support development and commercialization of our LRRK2 program, I think roughly on the timelines that Neil articulated. And I think the first step for us, once we made that decision, was to define what exactly it is that we thought we would want out of a deal on LRRK2. And that's what Mark is referring to as cornerstones, which are really just core principles for what Denali views as a priority in the context of a collaboration and everything else. So the partners we engage with, the eventual structure of the collaboration, the core elements of what we would fight for in a negotiation all flow from what those principles are. And so for us on LRRK2, we really had three cornerstones that I think we agreed upon internally late in 2019. And those were, first of all, we wanted to ensure that Denali was contributing meaningfully in clinical development and commercialization. And that's consistent with collaborations strategically that we've pursued in the past with other biopharma partners. For us, this is really about pooling capabilities and expertise and background information. And we wanted to make sure that the collaboration was set up in a way that would facilitate information sharing between the parties and really allow both parties to contribute meaningfully to development and commercialization. The second was to maintain speed and clarity in decision-making. As Mark alluded to, this is a gigantic cross-functional effort across two companies that do things very differently at times. And so we wanted to make absolutely certain that there was no ambiguity as to who is doing what and how we would work together and how we would make decisions, which I think explains the 25 pages of detailed governance language in the final agreements that we signed. And then lastly, we wanted to make sure that incentives were aligned. And I think this industry in particular is full of examples in the past of collaborations where incentives weren't aligned, which of course can cause problems 5, 10, 15 years down the road. And so we wanted to make absolutely certain that the parties were committed to exploring the full potential of these programs and developing Parkinson's disease and potentially other indications, and think about what our pain points might be and try and address those kind of in advance as a collaboration before we ran into issues. And so we defined those cornerstones early on. Those cornerstones drove the structure of the initial term sheet that we sent out that Mark and Neil pointed out. And that really drove the kind of cadence and tenor of the negotiations down the road after that.
Now that's so obviously there was a lot of groundwork that was already done, and I think it's always good to start when you have a very clearly defined goal, or at least from one partner's perspective, knowing exactly what they're looking for and going forward with, and that certainly helps. So maybe I'll just throw it in, and it's just an observation. So when you're talking about aligning the incentives of the partners, what were you looking at specifically? I mean, if you don't mind sharing, because it's a very broad concept of aligning incentives, and just try to understand what each party's incentive is can take a lot of work.
I'm happy to start, but would love to hear from Mark and Neil as well, because I think this is, to your point, well, it's a very broad topic. I think from our perspective, it's a few things, and it all starts with scope. So what exactly is in the deal? What are we working on together? What is it that Biogen brings to the table, and what is it that Denali brings to the table in respect of the programs that we are focusing on? The second piece of that, I think a little bit is deal structure and decision making. So once we've aligned on what the scope is of the collaboration, there's a question of who's doing what specific piece of work, who's making what decisions when. And Denali's incentives here are obviously to see the program forward, and we wanted to make sure that Biogen's incentives were also to kind of see the program forward in the same way that we would kind of want the program to proceed, and that's with speed and clarity and risk taking. And then finally, just downstream, and I think you saw this in the slides that we put together, there's cost and profit sharing in certain territories in respect to this collaboration. And so we wanted to communicate to Biogen that we really did want to put our money where our mouth was, and that we would co-fund actively on an ongoing basis development of the programs under the collaboration. And that to the extent that we made it all the way to commercialization, both parties would sort of contribute and benefit from the commercialization of programs as we try and deliver medicines to patients. So if you think across each of the elements of what constitutes a contract, what the scope is, what the structure is, what the financial terms look like, we tried to make sure at each step of the way that there was kind of very clear alignment and we were all pointed in the same direction.
That's good. That's helpful. And then obviously the structure and everything is then once you have it out there, then it's all negotiation, trying to figure out who's doing what to what level and to get to the right structure, like a 60-40 split. If you're trying to be equally partner, how did that discussion evolve in terms of deciding who's contributing what? Because you're more or less the structure is the deal is structured as each party is contributing something and each party is then getting a compensation or opportunity piece of the pie based on the contribution. But so how are you deciding on, for example, 60-40 split of R&D or a 50-50 profit sharing in certain territories versus different? Anybody can take that. Neil, Mitesh, you both had the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some level, I mean, there's no necessarily magic to those numbers. I mean, it's, I think to Mitesh's point, I mean, both parties wanted, kind of meaningful involvement, meaningful participation in the economics, and then, this alignment proceeding throughout, throughout the collaboration, right? So, sometimes you'll see, kind of big pharma, small company deals where, typically the small company doesn't want to fund as much or doesn't, may not have the capital to fund. And so, so I think this collaboration is unique because it, if you notice in the slides, it's a worldwide development split, right? So it's the costs are shared across, globally, but the profit participation is in, the United States and China, but it's still to ensure alignment on global development strategy, global commercialization strategy. I think that's all in there in how this has been designed. And so I think that's sort of the source of, kind of those splits.
Yeah, I can maybe add a thought here as well. And Helen, if you want to jump in, a couple things there is on, I always try to put myself in the partner's shoes when you're trying to figure this out. And, the saying of you got to put your money where your mouth is. And if you're really wanting to come to this in the spirit of trying to share in the risk, ultimately you've got to participate meaningfully, not both in just the operational elements, but also in contributing financially. And as Neil alluded to, this is where kind of the 40-60 on global development cost came into play. And Denali, as Mitesh mentioned earlier, one of our kind of guiding principles of the cornerstones was that Denali wanted to contribute meaningfully to the development and commercialization. And as part of that, I think we also had to make a commitment financially that basically, balanced that.
Yeah, and the equity part of the transaction, was that already designed, was a way of aligning on incentives? Or what was the desire for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can say from the Biogen perspective, I mean, we obviously, wanted to add another component to the deal, another way to participate in the upside of the program, a strategically driven investment. Unlike a lot of other larger biopharmas, I mean, Biogen typically doesn't make a lot of VC or equity investments unless they're associated with product rights in a deal. And so we did take equity in this deal, the Sangamo deal, the Sage deal, but that's actually, it seems like it's pretty common, but it's actually fairly rare. So, I think when we're looking at those types, we're looking at, the strategic nature of the deal, the long-term commitment of the collaboration, not only the LRRK2 piece, but the BBB technology, option and ROFN pieces. And so, where we see like the strategic fit, the long-term potential of not only the product, but as I said, the platform and even the other, assets in development. I mean, we viewed it as kind of a nice way to participate in some of that upside and also, have that sort of strategic investment.
Yeah. Mitesh or Mark, from your perspective, was that part of the design to start with as you were looking at the term sheet before reaching out to partners or starting the process, or is it something that evolved in discussions with the partners?
I can maybe say a few words here, and then Helen, Mark, please jump in. I think from our perspective, this evolved as discussions continued with Biogen. And I think it's just another example of really two things. The first is, I think, as you pointed out, it's about aligning incentives. And for all the reasons Neil articulated, I think there is a major strategic component to this collaboration. And I think both parties see the value in that. But secondly, I think it's an example of some creative thinking. And I think both parties tried their best as discussions evolved to be creative and meet each other's needs. And this equity component, I think, solved for clear kind of strategic alignment on Biogen's end and Denali's end. And I think was a nice idea to kind of help bridge the gap across the provisional and do the definitive agreement as discussions continue.
From an implementation perspective, did it add any level of complexity? Because being publicly traded and timing of the equity participation and all those things that come with it, how was that played? How did that play out?
I can maybe take a stab at this one too, and then Neil would love to hear your thoughts as well. I think we probably had something like 10 agreements as between both parties by the time we had fully executed the collaboration, and I think 3 or 4 of them were equity specific. And so it definitely added a fair bit of paperwork to the overall arc of the negotiation and ultimately the collaboration. But I would point out that, as Neil said, we're not in the habit necessarily of offering up equity in transactions that we have done, but we have done it before. And so we had precedent to look back on as Denali. I think Biogen had precedent to look back on as Biogen. And so I think we were able to relatively quickly get to something that both parties could live with.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It definitely adds some complexity. And yeah, we did have I don't know if it was 10, but it was definitely like high single digits. But yeah, I mean, I think in the end, I mean, that kind of stuff is usually secondary to, strategic rationale and that type of thing. And then, I mean, the only other small point I would make, for the real kind of like in the weeds licensing professionals is like the equity contracts, there's a few main things that you negotiate. The rest of it's like, a lot of it's boilerplate. And so it's actually less complex than the typical like collaboration agreement. So, if it, it had some complexity, but it's not like doing a whole nother, co-development, co-commercialization agreement, which those are, typically, hundreds of pages. I think the equity docs are, about a tenth of that. So.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's one angle of it. The other angle of that is just the time complexity, right? If you're adding another component to that, and then it can have an impact on which company it is, what they have to disclose to the market, what the timing of the earnings call is, and all those things can play into it in terms of trying to get the transaction done on time. To
maybe
Mark, you want to say something?
Yeah, maybe one comment. Just given the forum here, my guess is there's a lot of legal counsel involved here, and I would say when it came to the complexity of this type of transaction, this is where we were so grateful to have counsel, and I know both sides were using external counsel in this case on the deal, and they really stepped up. Particularly with regards to a lot of these ancillary agreements related to the equity. I mean, their expertise in this area was second to none. And so whilst we were, as a BD group, heavily focused on the collaboration itself and the structure of the deal, having our legal partners there, basically shoulder a lot of the extra load on some of these ancillary agreements was incredibly helpful.
One of my favorite sort of pet peeve is it's easier to negotiate with external partners, but it's harder to negotiate with internal stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about, from both your perspective, in terms of how you manage the internal stakeholders? Were there clearly an identified champion driving it, sponsoring it, that helped, or just give us a flavor?
Sure. I mean, I can start from the Biogen perspective, but obviously we'll want to hear from the Denali guys as well. Yeah, I mean, I think this project, like I said, I mean, there were, the support of the project was, fairly, fairly or organic. I think there were multiple levels obviously involved in the diligence. And so, as that work started happening, and those conclusions started migrating to the top of the organization, we were really able to then kind of get the executive team on board, and really Al Sandrock, our EVP of R&D, had this commitment to the collaboration of Biogen and really championed the deal at the executive level, along with our CEO, Michelle Vernatos. And so, I think, even at, fairly large biopharma, I mean, deals of this size, have to have that kind of level of sponsorship and,
Sure.
and kind of commitment. And so that's really ultimately what helped push it forward on the Biogen side.
Yeah, I'd echo all of that. I think that the deal made so much strategic and synergistic sense in terms of expertise and capabilities that you've heard from everyone here today, that there was pretty universal support, I think, across both organizations, executive management teams and the board. We leveraged a very kind of coordinated network of touch points at all levels. So from Michelle and Ryan to Al Sandrock and Carol, these relationships were very key and collaborative from day one. And at various points throughout the deal making, I think that support was really important to allow us to kind of build momentum and remove obstacles that were confronting the deal team, and ultimately just maintain a really high level vision and spirit of the deal. So.
Thanks for sharing that, Helen. Looks, you guys have been very generous with your time and sharing all the nitty-gritty of this. Let me ask you this from this. You lived through it, and obviously you guys did it by the book, building the trust, aligning, and all those kind of things when everything went smooth. Looking back, are there lessons that you would avoid in the next transaction?
I'll let the Denali guys take this one first.
Put the ball and
I mean, I'm happy to start here. I mean, I look at it more as, what are some of the things that, that we did, that we'd reflect on that I think is contributing to success. And then, maybe to highlight a couple of things here, and Mitesh and Helen jump in with some examples. Diligence, right? I mean, in a word, thorough. It was an incredibly sophisticated process involved. Biogen was at the top of their game when it came to actually digging through what ended up being thousands of documents, hundreds of questions that we fielded. But the point about diligence that I'd like to make here is that that's the early part of the relationship, and it's actually a two-way process. And so at the time that, Denali, we had to make sure we were organized, providing all the necessary information that Biogen needed. And again, in the spirit of putting yourself in your partner's shoes, I'm looking at a guy like Neil saying he's going to have to go to his, committees. He's going to have to talk to Al and basically be a deal advocate. And so our job was really about arming Neil and colleagues with all the information that they needed to basically, be champions for this deal. On the Denali side, though, it wasn't just about providing that information. We wanted to make sure that we were engaged, and we were learning through that process, trying to really understand, okay, which partners really had the commitment that we think it's going to take to get through this program, the program itself, who had the capabilities and experience, and were there any watchouts, through that process, personalities or, signals that maybe this program wasn't a fit. And obviously Biogen checked all of those boxes in terms of level of commitment. They're second to none in terms of the commitment to neuroscience, and obviously with LRRK2 as well, they were very familiar with that program. So that was kind of an area where I think is key ingredients to success. I'm not sure if Mitesh or Helen have any others they'd like to call out.
Yeah, I guess a couple of other thoughts to piggyback off of Mark's framing here. And we talked about this earlier, but defining your priorities early on, I think, is important. So what are the right cornerstones, and ultimately, what's the right process, and what are the right timelines on which we'd like to get this done? I think as Mark said, much of kind of a deal negotiation process and bringing everything to a close is to make sure that folks on the other side of the table are empowered to engage in whatever way they need to internally to make sure that conversations go okay, to facilitate the deal process moving forward. So one thing we tried to do, and Neil can opine on how effective this actually was, but was to be clear about this is what we need and this is by when we need it. And conversely, here's where we have flexibility so that we could make sure that there was an opportunity for us to work together and align on something that would work for both parties on a time frame that was consistent with our stated goals and objectives for the program at large.
Maybe just, I guess 2 more quick thoughts. One, again, invest early and continuously in those relationships at multiple levels in the organizations. That, again, the coordinated network of touch points was really crucial in getting this deal done in the time frame that we did. Allowing kind of the CEOs, the CBOs, the CMOs, functional leads, board members to be able to kind of jump in. And that required the deal team to kind of continuously keep our senior stakeholders informed on the deal progress so that if necessary, they could quickly engage as an alternative channel to the kind of the deal team. And lastly, I guess just to end on a higher note, we like to focus on mutual wins on issues where we can find common ground with the parties. We view the deal negotiation process as the kind of first step to the collaboration itself and kind of a much longer relationship. So for us, it was important to start things off on the right foot, even during the deal making. And hopefully, Neil, you felt that on your end.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Helen. And just to kind of echo that, yeah, I mean, I do think actually that, open and healthy conversations throughout the process and at multiple touch points, really goes a long way to ensuring a successful outcome. It's also, of course, important to bring along the key stakeholders, within the organization so that there are no surprises, at critical junctures. So I think, the Denali team and the Biogen team, kept in very close contact. I mean, obviously, the business development teams, but also, as Helen alluded to, different stakeholders in different parts of the organizations, and made sure to address and resolve, potential issues before they could snowball into something serious. And so I think this, close communication, really allowed us to bring the two teams along.
That's fantastic. I think we're just about on time in terms of what we wanted to do as a presentation. And I'd like to give a chance to the audience if they have any questions to open up. So I'm going to open up for Q&A, and I'm going to ask those who are attending if there's no issue of bandwidth, and if you're not shy, then it's okay to open your video stream so we can at least see that. It becomes a little bit more interactive and we actually can see you. Well, give them a few minutes if there are no questions coming in. Well, I'll start off with something, because I think I was listening to what Alex was saying in his acceptance speech, which was actually very inspiring, because he was very clear in terms of focusing on what was the ultimate goal, which was to bring therapy or to the people where there's none that exists. So when you have a broader goal, which is very clearly defined, it obviously makes it easier for everybody else to work towards that. But he also did mention about some drama along the way in the deal making, and they were saying there were many all-nighters. Do you guys remember spending any all-nighters anywhere, or anything about the drama? I'm curious.
I can maybe start, and I'll echo Alex, right? Ultimately, the goal is obviously to bring medicines to patients, and ultimately the goal is obviously to get the deal done to facilitate that process. But we were on fairly tight timelines throughout the process, partly as a function of where the program was, and Mark can speak to this a little bit more, but we really didn't want the deal negotiation to slow down the progress of the program scientifically, which meant that we really wanted to be in a position where we could bring our scientific colleagues and Biogen scientific colleagues together to start making decisions about path forward for LRRK2. And so we really tried to hold us as a deal team to some very, very clear and focused and formal timelines, just to make sure the tail didn't end up wagging the dog. And so we pulled at least one all-nighter I can think of with Denali, BD, Biogen BD, folks on leadership and legal counsel on Zoom all night in August. And then I think we probably were on Zoom fairly late in the evening and into the early morning a couple of more times, but I don't think those ran till 6 a.m. or anything like that. And those are the first actually 2 all-nighters I've ever pulled for work professionally. But was certainly a fun experience, and I think was important to the overall kind of arc of the discussions here, given, again, where we were at on timelines.
I guess it's fair to say that you want to avoid that in the next transactions, all-nighters.
I'll maybe add a little bit to that as well. I agree everything with Mitesh, what he said. But this, again, I'd like to just point out, external counsel. And I'd like to specifically mention Wilson Cincini on our side and Ropes and Gray on Biogen side. I mean, they were right with us every step of the way, for those all-nighters. And Mitesh mentioned a couple when we were signing agreements. I can guarantee you counsel was spending many more all-nighters as well, turning drafts. And so I think every deal has a bit of drama. And I think the BD folks in us, will say that you're always going to try to use that last minute of time that you absolutely have to try to get the best possible deal that you can for your company. I mean, that is ultimately our job. But as Mitesh alluded to, we also have to balance that and sometimes pull ourselves in when we remind ourselves, in the end, it's about the patients, and it's actually about the science that's driving this. And as BD professionals, we really can't, our job is not to get in the way of that, right? To find a solution for both sides, but to allow the science and the program to progress, all in the spirit of getting it to patients first. So a little bit of drama, but in the end, I think we all maintain that focus.
Yeah, and I'll just say, at least from the Biogen side, most of our team was in Boston, so it's 3 hours later for Boston than for San Francisco. And I think one of the one of the attorneys was in Hawaii, so 6 hours, 6 hours in advance. But I guess he had some early mornings, so it goes both ways, I guess. So, but no, yeah, for sure, you try to do your best planning, and we did actually have like a set of scheduled negotiations mapped out. And as Mark said, as you go through it, there's more complexity than you realize. Sometimes there's issues that you hadn't realized the other party was going to have, and so probably everyone on the call knows how it goes. You just you wind up going to the last minute to as Mark said, is try to get the best deal for both parties.
Yeah. So we have a question that I'm going to pose to both of you. Can the teams comment on any terms that started the most misaligned and how they navigated the issue? So where you were the farthest apart and in the end found a solution. Any example?
I'll go, and I'll share just a couple of thoughts at a high level, and I unfortunately will not be calling out any specific terms, but I can maybe speak to this just in general. I think obviously, as Mark and Neil have alluded to, in any negotiation, there's always going to be things where you start out really far apart. You can probably imagine what some of those things might be, given where both parties are coming from. And I think a couple of ways to think about addressing this. The first, and one that I think worked fairly well for us in the context of this deal negotiation, was just sidebar conversations. So picking up the phone and calling Neil, or having our counsel pick up the phone and call Biogen's counsel, I think can sometimes really help cut through some of the posturing and the back and forth, and really get down to what the heart of the issue is for both parties. And if fundamentally there's a much bigger issue that we're talking about, and the misalignment is around smaller points, I think a good negotiator will use that as an opportunity to kind of weave in a solution that maybe is more creative or more complicated, but ultimately solves for the needs of both parties. And I think that's the reason we had, high single digit or low double digit numbers of agreements and really long contracts, is we just have to weave in a bunch of complexity to manage around the edge cases that both parties are trying to solve for. I think the other thing that can help, and Helen alluded to this, as did Neil in earlier parts of this discussion, is just having really strong connections top to bottom across both organizations. So if there is something that we're struggling with on the clinical development plan, for example, having Denali stakeholders all the way up to our chief medical officer, and Biogen stakeholders all the way up to Biogen's chief medical officer, be able to pick up the phone and talk to each other about what the areas of sensitivity are, I think helps a lot too, because ultimately those are the people who are going to be living the collaboration, and it's their decision on how they want to navigate some of the specifics. So probably not the most helpful answer, unfortunately, but I think ultimately, as with all of these things, it just boils down to relationships from my perspective.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think in the end, it's people making deals. So it has to be on relationship, it has to be on clarity, and that's how you build trust along the process. Just a quick question on from Denali specifically, but Neil, you can also address on that. Obviously from Denali's perspective, when we have Mark here who's living the deal, so you talked about that, Mitesh, also about living the deal after it's done. How much thought process did you guys put in when you were constructing the deal about who's going to live it and how they're going to live it? Or did you have people involved early on who were going to live it to help you structure?
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Neil.
Okay, yeah, I didn't. Did you want me to take that lead, or did you?
Well, both of you can take it one by one. So why don't you start, Neil?
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I think I think it'll be a little bit different than Denali, but we have a fairly integrated team. Obviously, on R&D and manufacturing, and a lot of the other key functions are involved in the diligence and the planning, for the clinical development plan and all that type of stuff. And then something that's probably evolved a bit over time at Biogen, although everything goes through cycles at bigger companies. So maybe this probably happened at some point in time in the past, but we've started evolving alliance management a lot more, and even in like provisions of the contract and even in some pieces of the negotiation. Because to your point, it's just a lot tougher just being handed a 300-page document, the day after it closes and saying, all right, it's yours, good luck. Call me if you got any questions, So, we really, and I've done this even in other deals that, didn't have quite as much, of a co-development or co-collaboration, but I've just typically tried to start involving alliance management early, getting even input on sections of the contract and having them as basically part of the deal team from pretty much the beginning. So I think that was helpful. And then obviously, the R&D team carried over from the diligence team to the team working on the project. So that also obviously, helps a ton as well.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe to build on what Neil said there is, at least from Denali's perspective, partnering has always been core to Denali's strategy. And as such, we've actually built the internal capabilities to really enable that. And a good example is our corporate development group includes business development, it includes alliance management, and it includes strategy. And between Helen, Mitesh, and I, you're seeing representatives from all three of those functions here. And we were all involved in the deal. So, from day one, as we're working through and negotiating the different provisions and the structure of the agreement, there was both a BDI as well as an alliance management and strategy eye, knowing that, long term, and let's be frank, we hope and expect that this relationship is going to last 10 plus years, right? And so that's a long time. And no matter how good of a BD professional you are or a legal counsel, it's impossible to foresee all the different challenges that collaboration is going to experience in that 10-year time. So what you can best do, I think, is set up a framework by which the collaboration will try to operate within. But importantly, I think also build in a bit of flexibility in that agreement. And that is where I think a lot of thought was put into from both sides to make sure the collaboration had room to operate and room to grow. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes down to like trust and relationships and maintaining that alignment as you go forward.
Yeah, and to maybe piggyback off of what Mark said there, I think what you heard from us is that 2 of our 3 cornerstones actually focused on living the collaboration. We focused on aligning incentives and then also ensuring kind of clarity and speed and decision making. And so those are the areas that I think as a deal team, we spent probably the most time focusing on as we thought about how we might structure an arrangement exactly for the reasons Mark articulated. We're going to live this for 20 years or more. And ultimately, you don't know what's going to come up, but you want to make sure that you and your partner are best positioned to navigate those issues when they do down the road. I think the only other thing I'll say, just as a BD professional, is that I think it's really useful to sort of be involved in living a collaboration, that you are a part of negotiating in practice to the extent that you're in a setup that you're able to do that in. And Denali is obviously a smaller company than Biogen, and so all of us kind of do the deals and live the deals downstream. But that way, you know what to look for. And you're able to take lessons learned from past collaborations into future collaborations as well as you think about defining those principles and ultimately negotiating agreements going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Mitesh. I think you just brought home the point, and this is we're also exactly on time now, so I really appreciate that for keeping everybody on time. I've enjoyed putting this panel together, and we're really Mark, Neil, Mitesh, Helen. Congratulations once again for this distinction. And I don't know if anybody is familiar with the game of cricket. Biogen is on a hat trick now, so there's a bit pressure for next year because they won last year too. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for participating and being very generous with your time and sharing your thoughts. And congratulations once again. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Close it out.
Everyone, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.